Hello, and welcome to this week's reflections on the Revelation to John. If you haven't already, please go down below the video and click on the subscribe button and maybe the thumbs up icon as well. That will actually open up a formula where we can reach more people. I don't know how it works, don't pretend to, but that's what I understand. So thank you for joining me again this week. If you have questions or comments, you can put them in the comments section below the video. Also, there should be a link down there to the website where I cite resources and Bible verses that I'm using during these sessions. So I left off last time where we were opening the seals for the scroll, and we're in chapter 6, just started talking about that. And the first seal was in relation to the first of four horsemen. And we talked about how this first horseman, for the first seal, is, there's not a total agreement on what this horseman represents or what the writer represents. There is a concern over false prophets in chapters 2 and 3 that suggest he represents false prophecy. And that's the most likely interpretation. This would parallel Jesus' words in Mark, where the false prophets are one of the signs of the end times, or in fact, the first sign of the end of the age. And that's Mark chapter 13, if you want to look that up. And also, to the degree that a false prophet is an antichrist, not the antichrist, but an antichrist, so also this first writer in the book of Revelation is associated with a false prophet. Therefore, the first writer is an antichrist as well. And the second, third, and fourth writer, which we will read now coming up, or maybe you've already read it, I'll talk about it. So the first writer cannot be understood apart from the three that follow. They all are like a unit in a sense. The rider on the second, or fiery red horse, is given authority to take peace away from the earth so that people will kill one another. And this one receives a large sword with which to do his work. The rider on the third, or black horse, is holding a pair of scales in his hands when what sounds like a voice from among the four living creatures who worship around the altar says, "A quart of wheat for a day's wages, 3 quarts of barley for a day's wages, and do not damage the oil and the wine," in verses 5 through 6. The rider on the fourth horse, a pale green horse, has a name, Death, and is accompanied by Hades, which was the Greek god who was given authority over the underworld and the dead. And John adds that they were given power over a fourth of the earth to kill by sword, famine, and plague, and by the wild beasts of the earth. So the question is whether they in this reference refer specifically to death and Hades, or to the whole series of the four horsemen, which is now being concluded from the introduction. So again, I say these four constitute a unit. They act together in a sense. Clearly, the sword is an apt characterization of the second rider, verse 4. The famine is of the third. And what then is this new terror brought by the fourth rider? Not killing as such, for that was presented already in connection with the second rider. Death is linked to plague or pestilence, just as in the letter to Thyatira in chapter 2, verse 23. And so close is this connection that within one single verse, verse 8, the same Greek word, thanatos, is translated in one sense as death and in the other place as plague. So the fourth rider adds to the first three the awful prospect of disease, as well as the bearers of disease and desolation, the wild beasts of the earth. In effect, the statement that they were given power over a fourth of the earth to kill by sword, famine, and plague summarizes the activities of the second, the third, and the fourth riders, not merely the fourth alone. So those three, the four of them are a unit together, and those three are the retribution, if you will, via these violent acts. So listing calamities to come was common in Jewish and Christian prophecy, not least in the prophecies attributed to Jesus, for example, wars and rumors of wars in Mark, wars and revolutions in Luke, great earthquakes and famines and pestilence in various places, again in Luke, nation against nation and kingdom against kingdom, with earthquakes in various places from Matthew. Jesus said such disasters were the beginning of the birth pains in Mark. They must happen, but the end is still to come, he says in Mark 13. Similarly, in John's vision, the things described under the first four seals are indications of more terrible judgments to come. This is not the end, yet the beginning. So the sword, famine, and plague at the end of the fourth seal summarizes the effects of the second, third, and fourth riders, respectively. How do they affect our identification of the first rider as a false prophecy, which is what was mentioned in the Gospels of Mark and Luke? Why, for example, does this rider carry a bow, as in bow and arrow? The background of such imagery is that the God of Israel sends his arrows of judgment against the nations. And that you can find in Psalm 45, verse 5. And two notable passages in Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 23 to 25, and Ezekiel chapter 5, verses 16 and 17, even against God's own people. And I believe I have those all cited in the resources that you can find the link to in the comment section below. God says, I will heap calamities on them and spend my arrows against them. I will send wasting famine against them, consuming pestilence and deadly plague. I will send against them the fangs of wild beasts, the venom of vipers that glide in the dust. In the street, the sword will make them childless. In their homes, terror will reign. That's from Deuteronomy 32. And from Ezekiel chapter 5, God says, when I shoot at you with my deadly and destructive arrows of famine, I will shoot to destroy you. I will send famine and wild beasts against you, and they will leave you childless. Plague and bloodlust will sweep through you, and I will bring the sword against you. I, the Lord, have spoken. The expressions suggest a casual relation of some kind between the first rider in Revelation with his bow and the three terrible riders that follow. If the fourth rider summarizes the final three riders, the first rider anticipates them and speeds them on their way. The riders and horses are like arrows from the rider of the first horse with his bow. If the first rider represents false prophets and false prophecy, the vision confirms John's view that false prophets like the Nicolaitans at Pergamum and Jezebel at Thyatira are urging compromise with the values of the Roman Empire and are responsible for all of the troubles that are to come. So let me give you a side note here. Some Christians may wonder why God would do this to God's people. Yet in the previous chapters, we've already had warnings about false apostles, meaning those who are sent, false teachers, false believers, and so on. People who falsely claim to be God's people, yet they are liars. So these 4 terrible horsemen all stand under the authority of God and the Lamb who opens the seals from the scroll. They all ride out at the command of the 4 creatures, the living creatures who worship at God's throne. Whatever dreadful things may happen on earth, they are all within God's plan and under God's authority and control. God, in effect, is the one who draws the bow and sends out the arrows of misfortune. Here, no less than in the quotes from Deuteronomy or Ezekiel. So both the first and the second riders, and then all 4, are said to have been given the authority to do what they do. The first is given a crown or a garland of victory. The second, a large sword, and all 4 power over 1/4 of the earth. The true giver of such things can only be God or the Lamb. The terms of the famine introduced in the third rider are announced from the very throne of God. So perhaps the whiteness of the white horse is less a counterfeit of the purity of God and the Lamb, and more a signal to John and to us as readers that these horsemen are riding out as representatives of God, even though the tasks that they perform are destructive, no doubt about it. We are reluctant to blame God for any evil in this world. John, however, intends this message as encouragement. I know it's hard to see that at the surface reading, and that's why we do these studies, and I try to give you the best explanations I can. I'm not the smartest one out there, so feel free to do other research, find out what other people are saying, and weigh them against what I tell you. But the whole thing is John's word of encouragement to his people to whom the letter will be read, reminding us that no matter what happens, God and the Lamb are on the throne, setting the limits to evil and bringing their own wise purposes to realization. God has a plan for salvation. Some of it's going to hurt. Some of it will cost the lives of some other people. And what we need to remember as we read this is there are enemies in the book of Revelation. Evil forces arrayed against the power of God. These forces have only been hinted at in chapters 2 to 3, as well as the allusion to false prophecy here, yet they are not formally introduced until the latter half of the book, most notably when we get to chapters 12 and 13. So just for now, just realize these are not truly God's people. These are enemies of God, and they are false believers. They are liars. And then in chapters 12 to 13, when we get there, we'll get a better feel for just who these are and why they're liars and enemies. So the dualism of Revelation, in the sense of a great conflict between good and evil, does not truly begin until chapter 11. At least not that will make sense to us at the very earliest. For the moment, we just need to remember that God is in control, it is all under God's authority, and God's rule will be unchallenged. God will not lose the throne. So God is always on the throne. So Here we're going to talk a little bit about the souls and the altar that John sees in the vision. We're at chapter 6, verse 9. It is commonly assumed that the souls John sees under the altar, verse 9, are in heaven because the altar is assumed to be the altar in God's heavenly temple. When we read on in the book, we discover that this assumption is reasonable, since the altar in heaven is mentioned again in chapter 8, verse 3, twice, then again in verse 5, then 9, 14, and 16 in those chapters. So what is odd is that in describing the fifth seal, John speaks of the altar with a definite article, as if it would be well known to the people to whom he's writing these letters, those people in Asia Minor. Even though he now introduces it for the first time, he's under this definite article that says, you know what I'm talking about. No altar was included in his detailed description in the beginning, when he gave us the vision of the heavenly throne, the scene in chapters 4 and 5. The closest he came to mentioning an altar was a reference to golden bowls of incense, which is similar in the Greek word. It could be altar, it could be golden bowls of incense, represented, as he said, representing the prayers of the saints. So it is a worship kind of feel there, so altar isn't out of the question, but maybe he was using those terms interchangeably, the golden bowls of incense, the altar. Another odd thing is the phrase itself, under the altar. Who are these souls of those who have been slain because of the word of God and the testimony they maintained in verse 9? And why are they under the heavenly altar? There's a general agreement that they are martyrs, those who were killed for being active Christ followers, not the ones who are killed who are liars, who are false believers, but those who are true believers and have been actively proclaiming Jesus Christ. So even though no specific enemies or forces of evil have been named in chapters 4 through 6, the fact of martyrdom proves that such enemies do exist, and sooner or later must be faced. Elsewhere in the book of Revelation, the testimony associated with martyrdom, or these martyrs, is called the testimony of Jesus. Yet here it is more general, the testimony that they had maintained. Because martyrdom was not yet a widespread experience when this was written, at least not among the Christians, this first vision of martyrs is probably meant to include what we call Old Testament or Jewish martyrdom, as well as Christian martyrs. So the assumption behind the visions is that those who were to be killed as they had been in verse 11 is referencing some of the Old Testament prophets and etc. that proclaimed the word of God and were killed for it. Or as stated in chapter 14, verse 13, the dead who die in the Lord from now on. So there is some inclusivity between what will happen and what has happened. So from now on would be the Christians, martyred specifically for the testimony of Jesus. What had happened would be some who were martyred in what we call the Old Testament for the testimony that they maintained. I know this is a lot to grasp, but let's think as we read these things, let's try not to think dualistically, that martyr, because we're in the New Testament, they must be only talking New Testament and not Old Testament. Dualism says either or. Let's think and, both and, instead of either or. Many commentators find the fifth seal an allusion to the book of Leviticus, where talks about the blood of a sacrificial bull that was poured out at the base of the altar of burnt offerings in Leviticus 4:7. with the understanding that since life was thought to be in the blood of the animals and in the blood of humans, and since life, soul, self are all interchangeable terms in both languages, Hebrew and Greek, the lives or the selves of sacrificial victims could be thought of as being at the base of the altar, which also could be translated under the altar. So let's really look seriously, though. Would John have said under the altar when he meant at the base of the altar? He was familiar with Old Testament scriptures, or these scriptures as they called them. We call them Old Testament. So if he did not want to use the exact words of Leviticus, why would he not have written before the altar or in front of the altar, in the same way he described earlier what was before the throne in chapter 4, verses 5 and 6. Excuse me, forgot to freeze that. So John specifically chooses under the altar instead of before or in front of. So his choice of words here raises a distinct possibility that the souls he saw under the altar were not in heaven at all, rather far below it on the earth, the same earth that just had been scarred, or rather beaten up, whatever you want to say, by the disasters of the first 4 seals. So the earth is, a quarter of the people, at least on earth, are destroyed, and much of the earth is destroyed. John could have written under heaven or under the throne. Instead, he wrote under the altar, probably because the vision centered on what he has called elsewhere the prayers of the saints, not the souls themselves. Rather, the prayers are the sacrifices that ascend like incense from heaven to earth, or from earth to heaven, from under the altar to the altar itself. So these souls are not disembodied spirits. They're not ghosts or whatever. They are, after all, visible to John, nor are they the lives or the selves of slaughtered victims as a kind of abstraction, nor are they typical of what theologians like to call the intermediate stage, that interval between believers' physical death and the final resurrection. Rather, at least within the horizons of John's vision, these souls are people with voices and real bodies, like the beheaded souls that we will encounter in chapter 20, verse 4. They are martyrs, not just in the sense of bearing testimony, rather in the sense of having been killed, according to verse 11, for their testimony or because of their testimony. Like Abel, who we would consider the first martyr from what we call the Old Testament, and it says, God says, still speaks even from the dead in the book of Hebrews from chapter 11, verse 4, and compare that then back to Genesis chapter 4, verse 10. You should be able to find those on my link too. They cry out for justice to be done. Their prayer in verse 10 is the heart of the 5th seal, the cry for justice. It's a prime example of what was meant by the prayers of the saints in chapter 5, verse 8, and then coming up in chapter 8, verses 3 and 4. So let's further talk about the prayer and its answer. We're at chapter 6, verses 10 and 11. The prayer of these souls is like an accusing question. How long until you judge the inhabitants of the earth and avenge our blood? They may be saying, they are saying. And that's tempered by a reverent address to God as sovereign Lord. We cry out in anguish even after we recognize God's authority. God's still in control. Sovereign Lord, holy and true, how long until you judge the inhabitants of the earth and avenge our blood? It's a prayer for justice. It's a prayer for vindication that kind of borders on vengeance and echoes such biblical prayers as Psalm 79. How long, O Lord, will you be angry forever? How long will your jealousy burn like fire? Pour out your wrath on the nations that do not acknowledge you, or on the kingdoms that do not call on your name, for they have devoured Jacob and destroyed our homeland. And again in Psalm 79, why should the nations say, where is their God? Before our eyes, make known among the nations that you avenge and the outpoured blood of your servants or believers. So this anguished plea for justice is sometimes compared unfavorably with Jesus on the cross in Luke 23, verse 34, or the prayer of Stephen at his martyrdom in Acts chapter 7, verse 60, both for the forgiveness of their tormentors. One commentator says that the modern conscience is shocked at the passionate longing for vengeance breathed out by the martyrs, and indeed is beyond doubt lower in tone than the lofty spirit of forbearance which distinguished the Christian church in its earliest days. So Jesus and Stephen both cry out for forgiveness, while the martyrs are crying out for justice and vindication. Such comments presuppose a rather one-sided understanding of the ethics of both Jesus and Paul. Jesus asked in connection with one of his parables, "And will not God bring about justice," or literally retribution, "for his chosen ones who cry out to him day and night?" You can see that in Luke 18, verse 7. And when he blessed those who hunger and thirst for righteousness in Matthew 5, verse 6, his words could just as easily have been translated, "those who hunger and thirst for justice." As for Paul, he urged kindness toward our enemy to heap burning coals on his head in Romans 12, verse 20. That doesn't sound compassionate. What this may teach us is that God's love and forgiveness can never be divorced from God's justice or judgment on evil. Again, it's both and, not either or. You cannot say God needs to be compassionate and forgiving and not just or pass judgment on evil. God has to go together. It's all one as far as God is concerned. So the words of the ancient prophets, "Let justice roll down like a river and righteousness like a never-failing stream," Amos 5:24, are nowhere rescinded in the New Testament teachings. The prayer of the martyrs in Revelation is not a cry for personal vengeance, rather an appeal to a sovereign Lord, holy and true, to bring about justice in the world by destroying the powers of evil. It is an eschatological or end times prayer, no different in its import from "Your kingdom come," Matthew 6:10, "Deliver us from the evil one," Matthew 6:13, or "Come, O Lord," with its accompanying curse on anyone who does not love the Lord in 1 Corinthians 16:22, or even "Come, Lord Jesus," at the end of Revelation itself, chapter 22, verse 20, just after a pair of solemn warnings to those who add or take away from what is written. So let me just take a moment and give a side note here. As you consider this, a word of caution, if you will. Before you pray that Jesus come and bring justice, we need to understand that includes us, and consider whether each of us personally are prepared to face Jesus' justice. Or are we only interested in retribution against someone who we may not like, or someone who did or said something we may not like? Jesus' justice is not for our personal retribution. Jesus' justice is brought against the entire world all at once. Okay? Now let me leave you with that word of caution. You can go back and replay this video, check out the verses I put linked to our website in the comment section below. Questions or comments that you have, please add them to the comment section. I'll do the best I can to answer them. Like I said, there's a whole lot of people out there who are smarter than I am, and they understand this even better than I do. I'm just going to give you my thoughts and reflections. So thanks for joining me. If you happen to be in the Sun City Center area on Sundays at 10 a.m., join us in person for worship. If you can't join us in person for whatever reason, you're welcome to join us on live stream on this same YouTube channel. I hope you're having a great week. Take care. God bless.